John sat in his car, staring up at the mansion that had once been his home. He couldn't believe what had happened. His father, the powerful and wealthy man he had always looked up to, had stolen his girlfriend and forced her to marry him. Sarah had been the love of his life, and now she was trapped in a marriage to a man who was abusive and controlling. John knew he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. He had to find a way to save her. As he sat there lost in thought, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He jumped, startled, and turned to see Sarah standing there. She looked tired and worn down, but there was still a spark in her eyes when she looked at him. "John, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for any of this to happen." John's heart ached as he looked at her. He wanted to take her in his arms and hold her, to protect her from the pain she was going through. But he knew he couldn't. Their relationship was forbidden, and if they were caught, the consequences would be disastrous. "It's not your fault," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know you didn't want this." Sarah nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I have to go back inside," she said, "but I wanted you to know that I'm here for you, if you need me." John watched as she turned and walked back towards the mansion. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew he had to do something, but he didn't know what. His father was a powerful man, and he wasn't sure he could take him on. But as the days turned into weeks, John found himself drawn to Sarah more and more. He couldn't stand to see her suffering, and he knew he had to do something to help her. One night, he found her crying in her bedroom. He went to her, and without thinking, he took her in his arms and held her. Sarah clung to him, and for a moment, they just stood there, holding each other. And then, something changed. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with longing. John knew he should pull away, but he couldn't. He leaned down and kissed her, and Sarah kissed him back. They knew they were playing with fire, but they couldn't help themselves. They began a secret affair, meeting in secret locations and sneaking around behind John's father's back. As the stakes got higher, John found himself torn. He knew that their relationship was wrong, but he couldn't resist Sarah. He loved her, and he knew she loved him too. But he also knew that their affair could destroy them all. If his father found out, there would be hell to pay. John was torn between his love for Sarah and his loyalty to his father. As the months went by, John found himself spending more and more time with Sarah. They were careful, but they couldn't keep their relationship a secret forever. One day, John's father called him into his office. John's heart raced as he wondered if his father knew about their affair. "John, I need to talk to you," his father said, his voice stern. "I know about you and Sarah." John's heart sank. He knew this moment would come eventually, but he hadn't been prepared for it. "I'm sorry, Father," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "I know you didn't," his father said, his voice softening. "But you have to understand, this can never happen again. If anyone finds out, it could ruin us all." John nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. He knew his father was right, but it didn't make it any easier. As he left his father's office, he couldn't help but feel a sense of despair. He knew he had to end his relationship with Sarah, but the thought of never seeing her again was unbearable. But fate had other plans. As John was leaving the mansion, he saw Sarah standing by the gate. She looked upset, and John knew something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, his heart racing. "I'm pregnant," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. John's heart sank. He knew this was a game changer. They couldn't hide their relationship any longer. "We have to tell my father," he said, his voice firm. Sarah nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Together, they went back to the mansion and told John's father the news. As they stood there, waiting for his reaction, they could hear his footsteps echoing through the hallway. The door swung open and John's father stood there, his face twisted in anger. "How could you do this to me?" he roared, his voice booming through the room. "I trusted you and you betrayed me." John stood there defiant. He knew he had made a mistake, but he couldn't regret his love for Sarah. "I'm sorry, Father," he said, his voice steady. "But I love her, and I won't let you come between us." His father's face turned red with anger. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I'll make sure of it." As the days went by, John and Sarah waited for the other shoe to drop. They knew his father wouldn't let them get away with this, but they were determined to be together no matter what. And then one day, they got a call from the police. John's father had been found dead in his office, a single gunshot wound to the head. John and Sarah were shocked and devastated. They had never wanted this, and they couldn't believe that their love had led to this tragedy. As they sat in the police station, waiting to be questioned, they held each other's hands, their future uncertain. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew they had each other, and that was all that mattered. The investigation into John's father's death was long and complicated. In the end, it was ruled a suicide, but there were still many questions left unanswered. John and Sarah tried to move on with their lives, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They couldn't help but feel that there was more to the story than they knew. And then, one day, they received a letter in the mail. It was from John's father, written before his death. "I'm sorry for what I did," the letter read. "I never meant to hurt you or Sarah, but I couldn't stand the thought of you being together. I knew I had to do something to stop it. I hope you can forgive me." John and Sarah stared at each other in shock. They couldn't believe what they were reading. "He killed himself because of us?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. John nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "It seems that way," he said, his voice thick with emotion. They sat there in silence, trying to process what they had just read. They had never wanted this, and they couldn't help but feel guilty for their part in his death. As they sat there holding each other, they knew that their love had come at a great cost. They had lost John's father, and they had been forced to confront the darkest parts of themselves. But they also knew that their love was strong enough to overcome anything. They would face whatever came their way together. John and Sarah walked slowly, hand in hand, as they left the police station. They were still in shock from the revelation in John's father's letter, and they couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Do you really think he killed himself because of us?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. John squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I don't know, Sarah, but I do know that we can't change the past. We can only move forward." Sarah nodded, wiping away a tear. "You're right, but it's hard, you know. I never wanted anyone to get hurt because of us." John stopped and turned to her. "Neither did I. But we can't blame ourselves for this. We didn't force him to do anything. He made his own choices." Sarah nodded, and they started walking again. The sun was starting to set, casting a warm glow over the city. They walked in silence for a while, lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sarah spoke up. "What do we do now, John? Where do we go from here?" John took a deep breath. "I don't know, Sarah, but I do know that I want to be with you no matter what. We'll figure it out together." Sarah smiled, and John could see the love in her eyes. He knew that they would get through this, no matter what. They walked for a while longer, enjoying the peaceful evening. As they approached Sarah's apartment, John stopped. "I don't want to leave you," he said, his voice filled with longing. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I don't want you to leave either." John took a deep breath. "Then don't. Stay with me tonight." Sarah hesitated for a moment, but then she nodded. "Okay, I'll stay with you." John took her hand and led her to his car. They drove to his apartment in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they got to John's apartment, he led Sarah inside. She looked around, taking in the familiar surroundings. "It's been a while since I've been here," she said, smiling. John smiled back. "It has, but it feels like home with you here." Sarah blushed and looked down. John took her hand and led her to the bedroom. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other. And then, without a word, they fell into each other's arms. They kissed deeply, their bodies pressed together. They undressed each other slowly, savoring every moment. When they were both naked, they lay down on the bed, their bodies entwined. They made love slowly and passionately, each of them pouring their hearts and souls into the other. Afterward, they lay in each other's arms, spent and satisfied. They talked quietly, whispering sweet nothings to each other. As the night wore on, they fell asleep, wrapped in each other's arms. The next morning, they woke up early, still wrapped in each other's arms. They smiled at each other, happy to be together. "Good morning," John said, his voice thick with sleep. "Good morning," Sarah replied, smiling. They got up and got dressed, and then they went out for breakfast. They talked and laughed, enjoying each other's company. But as they ate, Sarah's phone rang. She looked at the screen and frowned. "It's my lawyer," she said, her voice tense. John nodded, and Sarah answered the phone. "Hello?" she said, her voice tight. She listened for a moment, and then her face paled. "What do you mean they're reopening the case?" she asked, her voice shaking. John could hear the voice on the other end of the phone, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. "But why?" Sarah asked, her voice desperate. She listened for a moment, and then she hung up the phone. "They're reopening the case," she said, her voice trembling. "They think my father's death wasn't a suicide after all." John's heart sank. He knew this was bad news. "What are we going to do?" Sarah asked, tears glistening in her eyes. John took her hand and squeezed it. "We're going to fight, Sarah. We're going to fight for our love, no matter what." Sarah smiled. and John could see the love in her eyes. Together they faced whatever came their way, determined to be together no matter what. As they walked out of the restaurant hand in hand, they knew that their love was strong enough to overcome anything. They had been through hell and back, but they had emerged stronger than ever. And as they walked off into the sunset, their hearts full of love and hope, they knew that their twist of fate had led them to where they were meant to be. But even as they walked, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They knew that the investigation into John's father's death was far from over, and they couldn't help but worry about what the future held. They tried to put it out of their minds and focus on their love, but the doubt and fear lingered. They didn't know what the future held, but they were ready to face it together. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation into John's father's death continued. The police questioned John and Sarah repeatedly, trying to find out what had really happened. But no matter how many questions they answered, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were still keeping something from the police. One day, they received a call from the police station. The detective in charge of the case wanted to see them. John and Sarah went to the police station together, holding hands. They were nervous and scared, but they were determined to face whatever came their way. The detective was waiting for them in his office. He looked at them sternly, his eyes cold. "I've been going over the evidence in your father's case," he said, looking at John. "And I have to say I'm not convinced that it was a suicide." John's heart sank. He knew this was coming, but he still wasn't prepared for it. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I mean that I think there's more to this story than meets the eye," the detective said, his voice harsh. "I think you know more than you're letting on." John shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice firm. The detective leaned forward. "I think you do, John, and I think you're hiding something. I think you and Sarah had something to do with your father's death." John's heart raced. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "That's not true," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We didn't have anything to do with his death." The detective looked at her, his eyes cold. "I think you did, Sarah, and I think you're just as guilty as John is." John and Sarah looked at each other, their eyes wide with fear. They didn't know what to do, but they knew they had to do something. "We didn't do anything," John said, his voice firm. "We loved my father in our own way. We would never hurt him." The detective leaned back in his chair. "I don't believe you, John, and I'm going to prove it." John and Sarah left the police station, feeling defeated and hopeless. They didn't know what to do, but they knew they had to do something. They went back to John's apartment and sat on the couch holding each other. They were lost in their own thoughts, trying to figure out what to do next. Finally, Sarah spoke up. "We have to tell the truth, John. We have to tell the police everything." John looked at her, his eyes filled with fear. "Are you sure we could go to prison for this?" Sarah nodded. "I'm sure. We can't keep living like this, always looking over our shoulders. We have to tell the truth and face the consequences." John nodded, and they held each other tightly. They knew they had a long road ahead of them, but they were determined to face it together. The next day, they went back to the police station and told the detective everything. They told him about their affair and how they had kept it a secret from John's father. They told him about the night Sarah had told John she was pregnant and how they had gone to John's father to tell him the news.